The tall crystal towers reached up into the evening sky like giant fingers pointing at the stars above, and Princess stood at the edge of her balcony, watching the horizon turn dark and her long silver hair moved gently in the wind like flowing water made of moonlight, and she wore battle armor that had been passed down through her family for hundreds of years, because tonight felt different from all the other nights she had watched over her kingdom. Behind her, the ancient dragon wrapped his huge black body around the base of the tower, and his scales looked like pieces of night sky that had fallen to earth, and his golden eyes never stopped moving as he searched the distance for any sign of danger. And the dragon and the princess had fought together for 300 years, bound by magic that was older than the kingdom itself, and older than most of the trees in the great forest. But tonight something in the air made both of them nervous and alert. The human soldiers had come to their world at sunrise, and they came not to conquer, but to help, because long ago their ancestors had made a promise to protect each other. And Captain led these soldiers from Earth, and he was not tall or short, and he had brown hair and a normal face. But Princess had seen the way his soldiers trusted him and followed him anywhere, and that told her more about the man than his appearance ever could. When the sun went down, the shadow creatures came pouring out of the rift like black water flooding from a broken dam. And these monsters were made of twisted magic and pure hatred, and they wanted to destroy everything living in their path. And the rift was a tier in reality itself that led to dark places where evil things lived and waited for chances to break through into worlds of light and life. Captain had been the first human to charge forward when the attack began, and he ran beside Princess. As they met, the shadow army in the valley below the castle and above them flew through the air breathing celestial fire that burned brighter than regular flames, and the fire turned the shadow creatures into smoke and ash, and the human soldiers used their plasma rifles that shot bolts of pure energy, and together the elves and humans fought as one army instead of two separate forces. Princess moved through the battle like a dancer, and her ancient sword cut through the shadow monsters with each swing, and the blade had been forged by her great-great-grandmother using starlight and dragon fire, and it could cut the connection between the creatures and the dark rift that kept spawning them endlessly. And every time she destroyed one creature, another would take its place. But she never stopped fighting and never grew tired. Fought near her, and she noticed that he moved differently than the elven warriors, and humans were faster in some ways and more direct, and they did not waste motion on fancy techniques, and used his combat shield to block attacks and his rifle to strike from distance. And when shadow creatures got too close, he used a knife that glowed with strange human technology, and together he and covered each other like they had trained together for years instead of just meeting that morning. For 3 hours the battle raged on, and bodies of shadow creatures piled up on the blood-soaked grass, but still, more came through the rift, and Princess began to wonder if they could truly win this fight, or if they would just fight until exhaustion took them, and then the monsters would overwhelm them through sheer numbers alone. Then she saw it emerge from the rift, and her heart went cold with fear, because this was not a normal shadow creature but something far worse and far more powerful. And the Rift Guardian was 3 times as tall as any elf, and it had 6 arms, and each arm held a weapon made from captured souls, and its eyes burned with hatred that came from watching 1,000 worlds die, and knowing it had caused that death. Princess knew this would be her final battle, and she accepted that because she had lived for 3 centuries protecting her people. And if she died doing that, then it was a good death, and she raised her sword high and prepared to charge at the Guardian, even though she knew she could not defeat it alone. But sometimes warriors had to try anyway, because trying was all that mattered in the end. But moved faster than she did, and he stepped directly in front of her, blocking her path to the Guardian. And he raised his combat shield even though everyone could see it would not be enough to stop the massive blade that the Guardian was already swinging down toward them, and shouted one word that Princess barely heard over the sound of battle, and that word was duck. She dropped to the ground without thinking, and the Guardian blade hit shield with the sound of a mountain breaking apart, and the shield shattered into 1,000 pieces, and went flying backward through the air like a leaf caught in a storm wind. And he hit the ground hard 20 feet away and did not move again, and the force of the impact created a shockwave that knocked even out of the sky. Princess screamed, and her voice carried pain and rage across the battlefield, and every soldier, both human and elven, turned to see what had happened, and they saw their captain lying broken on the grass, and they saw the guardian standing over him, ready to finish what it had started, and they saw their princess rising to her feet with fury in her eyes that could have melted steel. Recovered first, and the dragon crashed into the guardian with all his weight, and all his strength, and his claws tore through the ancient armor that protected the creature body, and princess ran forward and jumped onto the guardian back, and drove her sword deep into the spot where its heart should be if creatures like this had hearts, and her blade sank in all the way to the hilt. The guardian made a sound like reality itself was tearing apart, and it fell forward onto its knees, and then onto its face, and the rift behind it began to collapse and close, and all the remaining shadow creatures started to fade away like smoke in wind, because without the guardian to hold the rift open, they could not survive in this world. Silence fell across the battlefield, and it was the kind of silence that comes after terrible noise, when ears are still ringing and minds are still catching up to what just happened. And soldiers from both sides lowered their weapons and looked around at the carnage and the bodies and the blood. Princess ran to side and dropped to her knees beside him, and her hands were already glowing with healing magic that all elven royalty learned from birth, and the magic flowed from her fingers into his body, searching for life, and finding none, and his pulse was gone, and his chest did not rise or fall, and his eyes stared up at the stars without seeing them. Around them, human and elven soldiers formed a circle, and many had tears running down their faces, because they understood what sacrifice meant, and they understood that this human captain had given everything to protect someone he had only just met, and that was the kind of nobility that transcended species and culture, and even time itself. Landed beside Princess and lowered his great head until it almost touched the ground, and dragons did not cry, but the sound he made was full of grief and respect, and he knew that had earned a place in the songs that dragons would sing for the next 1,000 years. Then something impossible happened, and Chest rose with one shuddering breath, and his eyes snapped open, and they were glowing with an inner light that had not been there before, and he sat up slowly like someone waking from a long sleep, and he looked around with confusion on his face. Princess pulled back in shock, and her healing magic flickered and died, because this should not be possible, and death was the one law that even the strongest magic could not break, and yet here was sitting up and breathing and looking at her with those strange glowing eyes. The nobles who had been watching the battle from the safety of the castle walls began whispering among themselves and pointing at, and their faces showed shock and fear, because they knew that resurrections did not happen naturally, and something must have brought him back, and that something might be dangerous. Looked down at his hands and then at his chest where the guardian blade had struck him, and he touched the torn armor carefully like he was checking to see if he was really alive or if this was some kind of dream, and then he looked at Princess again. She did not know what to say, and her mind was racing with questions that had no answers, and around them the soldiers were staring and whispering, and some looked happy that their captain had returned, but others looked worried about what this meant. Spoke first, and his voice was deep and rumbling like thunder in distant mountains, and he said that had done something remarkable, and had earned the respect of all who witnessed it, but there would be questions about his return, and those questions would come from people who feared what they did not understand. Princess knew the dragon was right, and she knew that the nobles would demand answers, and they would want to know what magic had brought back, and whether he was still truly human, or if something else had taken his place, and she knew that protecting him from those questions would not be easy. But as she looked at sitting there confused and alive and glowing with strange light, she made a decision, and she decided that whatever had brought him back, she would stand beside him and protect him just as he had protected her, and that was a debt that could never be fully repaid. The battle was won, but Princess knew that a different kind of battle was about to begin, and this one would be fought with words and politics instead of swords and magic, and the outcome would determine not just fate, but possibly the future of the alliance between their worlds. The Grand Hall of Castle had never felt so heavy with tension, and Princess stood beside, as he faced the assembled nobility, and all the nobles wore robes covered with jewels and ancient crowns that sparkled in the magical light from 1,000 floating crystals. And behind them both coiled his massive body, and the dragon presence was a silent warning that he would not allow any threats to those under his protection. 3 days had passed since the battle, and 3 days of secret meetings that Princess had not been invited to attend, and she knew the nobles had been discussing, and what his resurrection meant, and whether he was dangerous, and she had spent those 3 days preparing herself for this confrontation, because she knew it would not be easy. Lord was the oldest and most powerful of all the nobles, and he had lived for 600 years, and in that time, he had learned how to use words like weapons, and his purple eyes fixed on, with an intensity that would have made weaker people look away, but met his gaze without flinching. The ancient elf rose from his silver throne with movements that were smooth and practiced, and when he spoke his voice sounded like ice cracking on a frozen lake, and he began by thanking for his service, and for sacrificing himself to save their princess, and he said they were all grateful for what he had done. Stood at attention in new armor that had been given to him by grateful citizens of, and the armor gleamed in the light, and Princess noticed that his hand kept moving to his chest, where the guardian blade had pierced his heart, and he had not talked much about dying or coming back, but she could see questions burning in his eyes. Lord continued speaking, and he used the word however, and that single word made Princess' spine go rigid with tension, because she knew what was coming, and the ancient elf said they needed to discuss the matter of resurrection, because such things did not happen by accident, and death was a law that even magic must obey. He gestured to all the nobles gathered in the hall, and explained that they had consulted with scholars and mages, and everyone agreed that something had changed on that battlefield, and something had entered him when he came back from death, and they needed to understand what that something was. Lieutenant Amy Parker stepped forward from the human delegation, and she was a sharp woman with gray eyes that missed nothing, and she had very little patience for political games, and she spoke with respect, but also with steel in her voice, and said that had every test their technology could provide, and he was the same man who had led them to victory. Lady interrupted, and she was known for having a terrible temper and powerful magic, and she said that human technology was impressive, but could not detect what elven people had studied for thousands of years, and magic left traces behind, and the traces around were troubling. Princess had stayed quiet long enough, and she stepped forward with her hand resting on her sword, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 3 centuries learning how to command, and she demanded to know what was so troubling about a man surviving when he had given everything to protect their kingdom. Rumbled his agreement, and the sound made the crystal chandeliers shake, and reminded everyone that the dragon loyalty was absolute, and not controlled by politics, and several nobles flinched backward, and Princess allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. She continued speaking, and said that if there was magic in now, then perhaps it was the magic of sacrifice and courage and bonds forged in fire and blood, and perhaps the universe itself had recognized that his death was unjust and sent him back to them, and she turned to face the full court, and her silver eyes blazed with conviction. She told them plainly that maybe they simply could not accept that a human had proved himself worthy of the same miracles that elves claimed as their birthright, and her words struck like arrows, and many nobles looked away in shame or anger. Lord laughed, but it was a cold laugh without humor, and he said her speech was pretty, but sentiment did not change reality, and then he revealed what they had discovered, and he said they had evidence of rift energy clinging to life force, and whatever brought him back might have used the guardian death as a pathway, and might be carrying a piece of the very enemy they had just defeated. The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Princess felt her heart sink, because this was worse than she had expected. And if the nobles truly believed carried rift corruption, then they would demand his immediate exile or worse. Finally spoke, and his voice was steady despite the terrible thing he had just been accused of, and he said they should test him and lock him in magical prisons, and bind him with spells, and do whatever they needed to do, but they should do it quickly because his people needed to return home, and he would not let political games delay them. He looked directly at Lord, and Princess saw something flicker in eyes, and it was that same inner light she had witnessed on the battlefield, and said he did not know what happened to him, or why he was alive, but he knew what he was, and he was a soldier who kept his oath, and if that was not good enough, then nothing would be. Lady raised her hand, and Princess felt magical energy gathering in the room, and several nobles were preparing spells, and the air crackled with power. But before any magic could be released, moved with speed that should have been impossible for something so large. The dragon placed himself between and the nobles and lowered his massive head until his amber eyes were level with lady eyes, and when he spoke his voice resonated through every stone in the castle and through the bones of everyone present. Declared that was under his protection, and any who moved against the human moved against the dragon, and he said he had tolerated their political games out of respect for his princess. But his patience had reached its end, and his tail swept in a wide arc, and several nobles had to scramble backward to avoid being hit. The dragon suggested that if they wished to test worthiness, then they should test him as warriors instead of politicians, and let him prove himself through challenges of skill and strength, the way their ancestors had done before courts and councils turned honor into paperwork. The suggestion created a moment of heavy silence, and Princess watched Lord face, and she could see him calculating and weighing risks and considering opportunities. And finally the ancient elf nodded slowly. He agreed to let prove his integrity through traditional trials, and he said there would be 3 challenges testing combat and wisdom and heart, and if passed all 3, then they would accept that whatever magic sustained him posed no threat. But if he failed even one challenge, then he would return to Earth immediately and never be allowed to set foot in their realm again. Lord asked if accepted these terms, and Princess saw the apology in eyes, because he knew the trials were designed to be impossible for anyone without centuries of training. And he was going to say yes anyway, because it was the only way to protect both his people and her kingdom from further conflict. But before could speak, Princess made her own choice, and she announced that he accepted, and that she would stand as his sponsor and advocate, and whatever he faced, he would face with the full support of the royal house. Rumbled his approval, and the sound echoed through the hall, and Lord's expression stayed carefully neutral. But Princess could read the fury in his eyes, because she had just turned his trap into a public display of royal favor, and there was nothing he could do without openly opposing the princess and her dragon. The ancient elf announced that the trials would begin at dawn, and he said, "May fortune favor the worthy," and then he swept from the hall with his robes flowing behind him, and all the other nobles followed in a rustle of silk and whisper of magic, and when they were gone, Amy Parker approached with her. The lieutenant spoke quietly and said she had been analyzing energy signatures from the battle, and she thought she knew what brought back, but it was not what the nobles believed. And if she was right, then the trials would be more dangerous than anyone realized for everyone else. Princess felt a chill run through her body, and she looked at standing tall despite the weight of impossible expectations pressing down on him, and she realized that the battle had not ended on that blood-soaked field 3 days ago. The real battle was only just beginning, and the true enemy might not be shadows from the rift, but the fears and prejudices that lived in the hearts of those who claimed to protect their world. Amy continued explaining in hushed tones, and she said her scans showed something incredible and terrifying at the same time. And the energy keeping alive was not dark magic at all, but something else entirely. And it was connected to the ancient pact between humans and elves. And somehow when died protecting Princess, he had become bound to that pact itself. She said the pact was like a living thing, and it had been dying slowly over centuries as both peoples drifted apart and forgot why they had allied in the first place. And when made his sacrifice, the pact had recognized true loyalty and had used the guardian death as a source of power to bring him back. But the problem was that the pact energy was not meant to sustain a single person, and it was burning through like a fire-consuming wood. And every day he stayed alive, he grew weaker, and the pact itself grew weaker, and soon both would collapse completely. Princess felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, and she asked how long had, and Amy looked down at her, and said maybe a month if he rested and did nothing. But if he pushed himself during the trials, it could be much less. Heard all of this, and his expression did not change, and he simply nodded, and said then they should make the time count, and he would pass the trials and prove himself worthy. And if he died doing it, then at least he would die with honor instead of fatting away in a bed somewhere. Princess wanted to argue and wanted to find another way, but she knew well enough already to understand that arguing would be pointless, and he had made his choice the same way. He made the choice to step in front of the guardian blade. She placed her hand on his shoulder and told him that whatever happened in the trials she would be there beside him, and they would face it together, and smiled. And it was a tired smile but genuine. Spoke again and said the trials would test in ways he could not imagine, and the combat trial would pit him against a warrior with centuries of experience, and the wisdom trial would challenge his mind with riddles and philosophy, and the heart trial would expose his very soul to magical examination. The dragon said these trials had broken stronger candidates than, and many had failed and been sent away in shame, but also said he believed in the human captain, because anyone brave enough to die for a stranger was brave enough to face anything. That night Princess could not sleep, and she stood on her balcony looking out at the stars and thinking about impossible choices and terrible odds, and she wondered if there was any way to save without forcing him through trials that might kill him faster. But she knew the answer, and the nobles would never let him go without proof, and the only proof they would accept was success in the trials, and so would have to face them no matter the cost. Somewhere in the castle was probably also awake and thinking similar thoughts, and preparing himself for what was coming, and Princess sent a silent prayer to whatever powers might be listening that they would give him strength. Dawn would come soon, and with it, the first trial, and Princess knew that everything they had fought for, and everything they hoped to build between their peoples would be decided in the arena of proving. She looked down at the city below, and saw humans and elves moving through the streets together, and working side by side in ways that had not happened for generations, and sacrifice had already changed so much. But would it be enough, and would he survive to see the world he had helped create? And these questions haunted Princess as she waited for the sun to rise. The arena of proving stood at the heart of the oldest part of, and it was a circular chamber carved from living crystal that had witnessed 10,000 years of duels and trials and tests of worthiness, and Princess watched from the royal platform, as entered the ring wearing traditional elven trial garments instead of his armor. The trial clothes were made of light leather and cloth that offered some protection, but did not restrict movement, and looked small and vulnerable compared to the massive arena around him, and perched on the highest tier with his amber eyes tracking every movement below. The first trial was combat, and Princess' heart sank when she saw who would be opponent, because Lady had chosen her champion very carefully, and Sir entered from the opposite gate, and he was a warrior mage who had survived 2 centuries of warfare. Wore silver armor that hummed with protective magic, and his sword blazed with captured lightning, and he was famous across the kingdom for his skill with both blade and spell, and many believed He was unbeatable in single combat. Lord Voice echoed through the arena announcing the rules, and he said the fight would continue until first blood or until someone yielded, and there would be no killing strikes and no permanent harm because the trial measured skill, not savagery. And then he said begin. Moved first, and this surprised everyone because most fighters waited for their opponent to attack first, especially when facing someone as skilled as but closed the distance with startling speed, and his borrowed blade swept in a low arc that forced the elf to parry instead of casting a spell. It was a human tactic, and Princess recognized it immediately because humans fought aggressively and never gave spell casters time to prepare their magic and kept pressing forward and never stopped moving and never gave a moment to breathe or think or cast. For 3 long minutes held his own through pure determination and training, and he fought like water flowing around strikes and never stopping, and never giving the ancient elf a chance to use his centuries of experience. But experience always matters in the end, and when finally created an opening with a clever feint, his counter-strike was too fast for normal human reflexes to track, and his blade should have drawn first blood across shoulder. Instead, something impossible happened and moved with speed that should not have been possible, and his body somehow anticipated the strike before it came, and his own blade caught wrist, and a thin line of blue blood welled up against the elf's pale skin. The crowd gasped, and some people stood up from their seats, and first blood went to the human, and everyone was shocked because this should not have been possible and stepped back and acknowledged defeat with a slight bow, but his eyes were wide with disbelief. Princess understood what had happened and had moved like an elf in that final moment, and actually faster than an elf, and something had changed in him during those crucial seconds, and it gave him abilities he should not possess. Amy Parker was typing frantically on her, and her expression was grim, and Princess made a mental note to speak with her privately after the trials because whatever the lieutenant had discovered was clearly weighing heavily on her mind. The second trial began immediately without giving time to rest, and a panel of elven scholars entered the arena led by Master, who was a philosopher sage who had debated with angels and demons, and had won arguments against both. The trial of wisdom was traditionally a test of knowledge and riddles and moral philosophy, and these were areas where humans with their brief rarely excelled, because wisdom supposedly required centuries of experience. Master smiled but Princess could see the calculation behind that smile, and the old scholar was already planning how to trap with impossible questions. Posed his first challenge, and he said that their kingdom had allied with people through an ancient pact, but suppose his superiors ordered him to act against elven interests for the greater good of humanity, and what would do? Princess recognized the trap immediately because if said he would obey orders, then it proved humans could not be trusted, and if said he would disobey, then it proved human soldiers were unreliable, and either answer would make him fail the trial. She opened her mouth to invoke her right as sponsor to advise him, but was already speaking, and his voice carried clearly through the arena. Said that Master was asking the wrong question, and the pact between their peoples existed, because both sides recognized that greater good was not something you could calculate by counting heads or measuring territories, and it was built on trust and understanding that some bonds mattered more than immediate advantage. He continued and said that if his superiors gave him such an order, he would do what he did on the battlefield, and he would step between the threat and those he had sworn to protect, even if the threat came from his own side, and that was not disobedience, but keeping the oath that truly mattered. Silence filled the arena, and even Master seemed surprised by the directness of the answer, and he opened his mouth to pose another question, then closed it again and nodded slowly. The old scholar said that wisdom was young, but it was true wisdom nonetheless, and he declared that passed the second trial, and the crowd murmured with surprise because no one expected the human to succeed at the wisdom challenge. 2 trials down and 1 to go, But Princess knew the third trial would be the most dangerous of all because the trial of heart was not a test of courage or emotion, but a magical examination that would expose the innermost nature of the person being tested. If truly carried some fragment of the Rift Guardian within him, then this trial would reveal it to everyone present. And if Amy Parker was right about the packed energy burning him up from inside, then that would also be exposed for all to see. Lady descended into the arena with her robes trailing behind her like wings, and her hands were already glowing with silver light. And she announced that the final trial required only that stand still and allow her to look upon his soul. She said if he had nothing to hide, then he had nothing to fear, and her voice was smooth. But Princess heard the threat beneath the words. Growled from his perch high above, but Princess placed a calming hand on the dragon's scales, because this had to happen, and if past this trial then the nobles would have no choice but to accept him. Spread his arms wide and stood defenseless as Lady approached, and her spell wove itself around him like threads of living moonlight, and the magic penetrated skin and bone to touch the essence of who he was. The arena held its collective breath, and Princess' hand moved to her sword without conscious thought, and she was ready to defend if the spell tried to harm him. Then Lady stumbled backward, and her spell shattered like glass breaking, and her face went bone white with shock, and she whispered that it was impossible. She said there was nothing there, and no rift energy, and no shadow corruption, and nothing. But then she stopped speaking and looked at with something that might have been terror. Lord demanded that she speak clearly and tell them what she found, but before Lady could answer collapsed, and his body hit the arena floor hard, and Amy Parker vaulted over the railing and rushed to his side. Princess was right behind her and spread his wings to descend, and they reached just as his eyes snapped open, and they were glowing with that brilliant inner light. And for the first time, Princess understood what Amy had been trying to tell them. Amy spoke with a shaking voice and said that was not possessed by the Rift Guardian, but by something opposite. And when the Guardian died and the rift collapsed, all that energy had to go somewhere. She explained that the energy went into, but it was not dark magic, but the pure essence of the pact itself, and the oath that bound humans and elves together, and was literally being kept alive by the same force that brought human armies to their world. Amy looked up at Princess with tears streaming down her face and said that was dying, and the pact energy was holding him together. But it was not sustainable, and every moment he stayed there, and every time he used its power, it burned him up from the inside. The nobles were gathering around now, and their hostility was replaced by confusion and growing horror, and Princess knelt beside, and her healing magic reached out instinctively, and she felt the truth of Amy's words. Life force was like a candle being consumed by its own flame, and it was bright and intense, and terrifyingly temporary. Hand found Princess' hand, and his grip was surprisingly strong, and he said quietly that he knew and he had known since he woke up, and he could feel it eating away at him. He smiled, and it was the saddest thing Princess had ever seen, and he said that if he had to go out, he might as well make it mean something. Princess said no with fierce conviction, and there had to be a way to save him, and she looked at and thought about old magic and binding spells. Lord spoke, and his voice was uncharacteristically gentle, and he said that if what Amy said was true, then had become something unprecedented, and he was a living vessel for the pact itself. The ancient elf continued, and said that to save would require the pact to be renewed and strengthened, and not just with words and treaties, but with a true binding, and a merging of essence between their peoples. Rumble shook the arena, and the dragon said that Lord was speaking of the ancient rite and the soul binding, and it had not been performed in 3,000 years. The dragon explained that the ritual would require a volunteer from each side to serve as anchors, and they would permanently tie their life forces to the pact and sustain it with their own existence. Princess understood immediately, and someone from Earth and someone from would have to sacrifice their independence and their separate existence to become living bridges for the pact. They would be bound together, and their fates intertwined and neither fully themselves nor fully merged for the rest of their very long lives, and it was the kind of sacrifice that demanded too much. She looked at and thought about 3 centuries of duty, and standing alone on balconies watching for threats and fighting battles with only for true companionship. She thought about what it might mean to be bound to someone who understood sacrifice the way she did, and without hesitation, she announced that she would do it, and she volunteered to serve as anchor for. The gathered nobles erupted in protest, but Princess stood and pulled up with her and roared his approval, and the sound silenced the crowd. Amy Parker was already nodding, and she said that she volunteered for Earth because had been her friend for 10 years, and if this would save him and strengthen the bond between their peoples, then she was honored to accept. Lord looked between them, and his ancient face showed the full weight of his centuries, and he asked if they understood what they were offering. He explained that they would be changed fundamentally and permanently, and they would live as long as the pact survived, and they would be bound to each other and to this magic, and there was no revering this ritual. Princess and Amy said together that they understood, and their voices rang with certainty. Tried to protest and tried to stand, but his strength was failing, and Princess caught him and cradled his head, and made a silent promise that she would see this through. As the nobles began preparations for the ancient ritual, Princess looked up at, and the dragon met her gaze with something that might have been pride or sadness, or perhaps both. The ritual chamber lay deep beneath castle, and it was carved from the same crystal as the arena, but infinitely older, and its walls bore runes that existed before the kingdom itself, and Princess stood in the northern circle, wearing simple white robes instead of her royal armor. Across from her, Amy Parker stood in the southern circle, and she wore similar white robes, but with her military insignia pinned over her heart, and it was a small rebellion against tradition that Princess found herself respecting. Between them lay on an altar made of pure starlight, and his breathing was shallow, and his skin was growing translucent, as the packed energy continued to consume him, and coiled his massive body around all 3 circles, and the dragon formed a living boundary that would contain the magic about to be unleashed. Lord and Lady stood at the eastern and western points, and their rivalry was set aside for this moment, as they prepared to channel forces that neither could control alone. The assembled nobles watched from a gallery above, and their faces were illuminated by the soft glow of the chamber crystals, and Princess could feel their fear and uncertainty, but also their hope. Word had spread through the kingdom about what was happening, and humans and elves alike had gathered outside the castle, and they held vigil for their unexpected champion, who had sacrificed everything for people he barely knew. Lord spoke with ceremonial weight, and his voice echoed through the chamber, and he asked each of them one final time if they understood that this binding could not be undone. He explained that they would share emotions and thoughts and life force with each other, until the pact itself was broken, and to harm one would be to harm all. Princess said clearly that she understood, and Amy echoed the same words and tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper, and Princess reached across the space between circles, and Amy did the same, and their hands met over chest. They felt it then, and it was the first whisper of connection, and the way their life forces recognized something compatible in each other. Lady began the chant in the old tongue, and the words hurt to hear, because they carried the weight of creation itself, and the runes on the walls blazed to life, and Princess felt magic flowing through the chamber that was unlike anything she had experienced before. This magic was older than dragon song and deeper than earth roots, and vast as the spaces between stars. Lord joined his voice to Lady chant, and the ritual shifted into its second phase, and Princess gasped as her consciousness was suddenly split. She could feel Amy determination, and grief and fatting struggled to hold on, and beneath it, All she could sense the vast, wounded architecture of the pact itself. It was like looking at a tapestry with 1,000 broken threads, and it was still holding together through sheer momentum, but fraying more with each passing moment. Princess understood now, and this was what had become, and he was not possessed by darkness, but transformed into a living representation of those broken threads. He was dying because the pact was dying, and the pact was dying because both peoples had allowed it to become words on paper instead of a living bond of trust and shared purpose. Voice rumbled through the chamber, and he said that now they must give of themselves, and not blood or magic, but essence, and the core of who they were must be woven into the pact renewal. He warned that this would hurt, and this would change them, but it was the only way to save and strengthen the alliance. Princess did not hesitate, and she reached deep inside herself past her memories and skills and royal training, and down to the fundamental truth of her being. She found her love for her people and her willingness to stand between them and any threat, and her understanding that duty and choice were not opposites, but two faces of the same coin. She pulled that truth up and out, and offered it to the magic, and it felt like tearing out her own heart, and she screamed, but the sound was lost in the roar of power that filled the chamber. Beside her she felt Amy doing the same, and Amy offered up her core truth, which was loyalty to those who stood beside her, and fierce protectiveness of someone who had seen too many friends fall. Amy truth was the stubborn insistence that oaths matter more than survival. Their essences met above body and merged, and two different truths became a single new truth, and that truth was that the strongest bonds are those chosen freely. The new truth said that protection flows in all directions, and duty to something larger than yourself is not a burden but a gift. This combined truth poured into like liquid light, and Princess felt his life force stabilize and strengthen and begin to heal. But the ritual was not finished, and the pact itself began to respond, and its ancient consciousness was awakening from long slumber. Princess suddenly understood something profound, and the pact was not just an agreement between peoples, but a living entity that had been born from the first oath sworn between human and elf. It was sustained by every act of cooperation and trust across the centuries, and it had been starving for a very long time. The pact reached out, and Princess felt it connecting to thousands of minds across both worlds, and every human who had ever fought beside an elf, and every elf who had ever shared knowledge with a human. Every moment of genuine alliance and friendship throughout the centuries was a thread, and the threads were thin and frayed, but they were there. The pact began to weave these threads together, and it used Princess and Amy as the central pillars around which to rebuild itself. Eyes opened and they were glowing brilliant white now, and he sat up slowly, and his voice when he spoke was his own, but also something more. It was the voice of the pact itself speaking through a willing vessel, and he said thank you, and he looked between Princess and Amy. He said he could see now what he was meant to be, and not just a soldier but a bridge, and not just surviving but connecting. The light around them intensified until Princess had to close her eyes, and she felt her consciousness expanding and touching Amy consciousness, and touching consciousness. Then her awareness reached outward through the renewed threads of the pact and brushed against countless others, and she felt human courage and elven wisdom blending together. She felt mortal urgency and immortal patience, all mixing into something new and stronger than either race alone. When the light faded, Princess found herself still standing in the northern circle, but she was changed, and she could feel Amy's presence in the back of her mind like a warm, steady flame of determination. She could feel consciousness now stable and whole and pulsing with new purpose, and she could feel the pact itself no longer a dying thing, but a growing network of connection that spread across both worlds like roots seeking water. Lord said that the ritual was complete, and the pact was renewed, and the three of them were its living anchors bound together for as long as the alliance endured. He asked how they felt, and his voice was filled with awe. Princess took inventory of herself, and she was still herself with her memories and skills and personality intact. But now, she carried Amy military precision and unshakable moral clarity as well. It was not replacement but addition, and she said that she felt whole and more whole than she had been in centuries. Amy nodded with a wondering smile on her face, and said she could feel the pact and every connection and every bond, and it was beautiful. She looked at her hands and asked if she was not entirely human anymore. Lady confirmed this and said that Amy was not entirely elven either, and the three of them were something new. They existed at the intersection of their peoples, and they were unique and unprecedented, and absolutely vital to continued survival. Stood from the altar, and Princess saw that his wounds had healed completely, and more than that, he seemed to glow from within. The packed energy that had been consuming him was now integrated fully into his being, and he looked at his hands and then at Princess and Amy, and he laughed. It was a sound of pure joy and relief, and he admitted that he had been so scared of dying, and not the first time on the battlefield, because that happened too fast. But afterward he said, and feeling himself slip away bit by bit had been terrifying, and he looked at Princess, and thanked her for giving him a chance at something more than just a slow fade. Uncurled from around the circles, and his amber eyes studied the three of them with deep satisfaction. The dragon said they had done more than save one life, and they had given both peoples a gift they did not know they needed. He said they were living proof that the barriers between them were illusions and strength comes from unity rather than isolation. Lowered his head until he was eye level with, and told him that he had earned a place in the stories that would be told for 10,000 years. The nobles in the gallery were already talking among themselves, and their earlier hostility was replaced by animated discussion of what this meant for diplomatic relations and trade agreements and military cooperation. But Princess noticed that many nobles were also touching their own hearts, as if feeling the renewed pact for the first time. They were recognizing the network of connection that now bound their world to earth in ways that went deeper than any treaty. Lord approached Princess, and his ancient face showed something that might have been respect. He said she had made a choice today that would define the future of their realm, and perhaps in ways they could not yet imagine. He looked at an Amy and admitted that he had judged harshly and saw only threat where he should have seen opportunity, and for that he apologized. Said simply that the apology was accepted, and Lord was protecting his people, and would have done the same in his position. Lord said perhaps that was true, but he would not have had the courage to step beyond his fear as did. He turned to address the gathered nobles and declared that an Amy Parker and Princess were hereby named pact anchors. They were honored defenders of the alliance with all rights and responsibilities that entailed, and he said that any who doubted the strength of their bond with Earth should look upon these three and remember that they were stronger together. The nobles responded with a cheer that echoed through the chamber, and above them outside the castle Princess could hear the gathered crowd taking up the cry. Human and elven voices blended together in celebration, and it was a sound she had never heard before, and it was not just acceptance but genuine joy at the thought of deeper union between their peoples. As the ritual chamber began to empty, Amy touched Princess' arm and said she needed to return to Earth soon to file her report with command. But she could feel through the bond that she would be coming back, and this was not goodbye. Princess agreed and smiled, and said they were bound now, all three of them, and distance would not change that. Wherever Amy went, part of her would stay with them, and part of them would go with her. Was looking at his hands again, and watching small bits of light dance across his skin. He said he could feel every thread of the pact now, and every human who ever fought beside an elf, and every elf who ever saved a human life. It was like standing in the middle of a vast web and feeling every vibration and every connection. 6 months had passed since the ritual, and Princess stood once again on the royal balcony watching the horizon. But this time she was not alone and stood beside her, and his hybrid nature was now evident in subtle ways. His eyes held a faint glow, and his movements carried the fluid grace of elven reflexes, and his lifespan had been extended to match Princess' own centuries. And through their bond, she could feel his contentment mixed with a touch of restlessness. He was a soldier without a war, and it was wearing on him. Below them, the city had transformed, and human technicians worked alongside elven craftsmen, and they were blending advanced technology with ancient magic to create wonders neither could have achieved alone. The marketplace that once kept human and elven goods separate now mixed them freely, and traders sold everything from energy weapons enhanced with magic crystals to traditional elven bows fitted with targeting computers. Said quietly that it was strange because he came to fight a war, and now he was watching two civilizations merge, and it felt like a bigger battle than any he had fought with weapons. Princess smiled and said that bringing cultures together was always a war, and it was fought with patience and compromise rather than swords, and she felt through the bond what he had not said aloud. He missed Amy, who had returned to Earth 3 months ago to help coordinate the integration efforts there, and the separation did not break their connection, but it made it ache like a phantom limb. As if summoned by their thoughts, landed on the balcony with a rush of wings, and Amy Parker climbed down from the dragon back. She was dressed in a new uniform that blended Earth military styling with elven decorative elements, and it was a visual representation of what they had all become. Princess embraced Amy warmly, and through the bond she could feel the lieutenant exhaustion and excitement, and she asked what news Amy brought from Earth. Amy said both good and complicated, and she pulled out her then laughed and put it away because she could just show them through the bond instead. Princess and both opened themselves to the connection, and suddenly they were seeing through Amy memories. Earth Command had been struggling with the implications of the renewed pact, and some officials celebrated it while others feared it. But over the past month strange incidents had been occurring that changed minds and hearts, and human soldiers in danger suddenly found themselves with enhanced reflexes they had not earned. Elven scholars were solving problems by accessing knowledge they had never studied, and the pact was not just political anymore, but actively helping both peoples in moments of need. Amy said that was why she had come, because Command wanted to establish a formal embassy with permanent human residents who could study the pact and help strengthen it. But there was a problem, and she looked at and said they wanted him to lead the embassy. He was the most visible symbol of cooperation between their peoples, and people on Earth trusted him, but that would mean staying in permanently and giving up any chance of returning home. Was silent for a long moment, and Princess could feel the conflict within him through the bond, and duty was pulling him in multiple directions at once. Finally he spoke and said that he died on this battlefield, and everything after that had been a gift and a chance he should not have had. If he could use that chance to build something lasting between their peoples, then both worlds already felt like home to him. Princess said gently that he did not have to decide this moment, and he should take time, but interrupted and said he had already decided. The pact chose him for a reason, and who was he to argue with the universe? And he turned to Amy and said he would accept, but only on one condition. He wanted Amy to stay too, because if he was going to build bridges, he needed someone who understood both sides as well as he did. Amy's surprise flickered through the bond before being replaced by determination, and she said she would need to clear it with her superiors, but she thought that was where she was supposed to be. That was where they were all supposed to be. Who had been listening in silence rumbled his approval and said they continued to surprise him. Most beings would see their binding as a burden or limitation, but they had transformed it into purpose. The dragon said he suspected the universe had that intention all along because fate had a way of disguising gifts as accidents. A messenger appeared at the balcony door, and it was one of Lord Attendant's, and he brought urgent news from the eastern border. The watch posts reported activity near the site of the old rift, and nothing hostile yet, but the energy readings were unusual. Princess Felt and Amy immediately shift into alert mode through the bond, and their minds were already analyzing tactical considerations. She was about to do the same when she felt something else, and it was a whisper through the packed network, and it carried not threat but invitation. Whatever was happening at the rift site wanted to be found. Princess commanded the messenger to prepare her guard, but said this was not a military matter, and she told Amy to come with her, and said they would need perspective on this. As they flew toward the eastern border, Princess opened herself fully to the packed sense that had become second nature over the past months. The threads of connection between human and elf pulsed with healthy light now, and they were stronger than they had been in centuries. But near the rift site something new was forming, and it was a different kind of thread that reached toward neither Earth nor, but somewhere else entirely. They landed near the collapsed rift to find a sight that took Princess' breath away. The tear in reality had healed as she had seen with her own eyes months ago, but now in its place, something new was growing. It was a bridge made of crystallized magic that extended upward into dimensions she could not quite perceive, and on that bridge stood a figure. The figure was tall and vaguely shaped like a person, but composed entirely of shimmering energy that looked like the pact itself. When it spoke, its voice resonated through all three of them simultaneously, and it spoke directly to their bonded consciousness. The being said greetings anchors and introduced itself as an emissary, and explained that when they renewed the pact, they did more than save one alliance between two worlds. They created a beacon and proof that different peoples can become one without losing what makes them distinct, and this had drawn attention. Hand moved to his weapon, but Princess touched his arm because through the bond she could sense no hostility from this being and only curiosity, and something that felt like hope. Princess asked carefully where this attention came from. The emissary replied that it came from the multiverse, and explained that there were thousands of worlds out there, and each had their own conflicts and divisions. Some faced threats like the Shadow Legions that attacked, and others simply tore themselves apart from within. The pact they created offered a solution and a way forward that many had sought, but none had achieved. The figure gestured toward the bridge and said they wished to learn from Princess and her companions, and if they were willing, the emissary wanted to help them extend this network of connection to other worlds that desperately needed it. Amy let out a low whistle and said the emissary was talking about making the pact work across multiple universes and connecting dozens or maybe hundreds of different civilizations through the same kind of bond they had created. The emissary said precisely, and explained they would not force different peoples to become one, but help them recognize that unity and diversity were not opposites. Strength comes from connection, not isolation. The being looked at each of them in turn and said they were uniquely qualified for this task because they had become the living embodiment of this truth. But it would mean leaving their worlds behind at least for a time and becoming travelers and diplomats and champions of connection across infinite realities. Princess Felt and Amy immediate interest through the bond, but also their concern, because this was not a small thing being asked of them. This was a fundamental change to their purpose and their lives, and their responsibilities to their own peoples. Lord, who had arrived with scholars, stepped forward and asked what would happen to because the princess had duties, and they could not simply lose their royal heir to some journey across universes. The emissary tilted its head and said the pact they created was self-sustaining now, and it had roots deep enough in both populations that it would continue to grow without constant attention from its anchors. Their peoples no longer needed champions to fight for them, but needed examples to show them what was possible. And what better example than three beings who chose to become more than they were for the sake of others? Who had been studying the bridge with intense focus finally spoke and said this was dragon magic, and it was ancient and powerful. It was a gift from his people to the multiverse, but locked away because it was deemed too dangerous after the reality wars. The dragon said his ancestors built these bridges to connect worlds peacefully, but they were sealed when beings learned to turn them into weapons. If the bridges were opening again, it meant the multiverse itself had decided the potential benefit outweighed the risk. Said practically that it could also mean something was forcing them open, and they needed to figure out if it was friendly before committing to anything. The emissary acknowledged that his caution was wise, and said it offered no demands but only invitation. They should travel to one world that needed what they had learned and see if their methods could help others. If they decided this was not their path, the bridges would return them home with no obligation. Princess looked at her dragon and her bond mates and the assembled nobles of her court. She thought about duty and destiny, and about the life she had known for 3 centuries and the life she might still live. Through the bond, she felt excitement at the prospect of new challenges and Amy's strategic mind, already calculating how their experience might translate to other conflicts. But it was who made the decision for her, and the dragon announced he would come with them. If his princess chose this path, she would not walk it alone, and perhaps it was time for dragons to remember their purpose as bridge builders rather than treasure keepers. Lady surprised everyone by stepping forward as well, and said the Council of Mages had discussed this possibility since the ritual. They suspected the pact renewal might have broader implications, and she volunteered to accompany them to study other worlds and their magic systems. Knowledge must be shared for the pact to truly grow, she said. One by one, others volunteered, and human technicians, and elven warriors and scholars and soldiers, who understood that what had been created here was too valuable to keep to themselves. Lord, after a long silence, finally nodded his acceptance and said, "Very well, but they would not go as wanderers without purpose. They would go as ambassadors of the alliance between and Earth, with all the authority and responsibility that entailed." He looked at Princess with something approaching fatherly affection, and told her this was not exile but expansion, and her throne would wait for her. Princess felt unexpected tears in her eyes, and she had been prepared to give up her position, and her home and everything she had known. But her people were offering her the chance to grow without losing her roots, and through the bond she felt and Amy, matching relief and determination. Princess said to the emissary that they accepted the invitation, and asked it to show them these worlds that needed help. She said they would share what they had learned, and that fear can transform into trust and enemies can become family, and the strongest bonds are those freely chosen. The emissary bowed deeply and said the multiverse was vast and strange, and some worlds would welcome them, while others would reject them. But in all cases, they would carry proof that unity was possible, and that was a light no darkness could fully extinguish. As preparations began for their journey, pulled Princess and Amy into a tight embrace, and through the bond they shared everything. They shared hope and fear and excitement, and understanding that they were about to embark on something unprecedented. They had already saved 2 worlds, and now they might have the chance to save many more. Said with a grin that was pure mischief that they went from a simple military alliance to becoming travelers across universes, and that was quite the promotion. Amy laughed and said she was more interested in the travel benefits, because how many people could say they visited other realities? Princess smiled at them both and called them her bond mates and her friends and her family. She said that however many worlds they visited, and whatever challenges they faced, they should remember they did not get here by being exceptional. They got here by choosing to trust each other, and by being willing to change, and by believing that connection matters more than separation. She looked up at Hu, nodded his massive head in agreement, and said that was the truth they would carry to other worlds. Not that they had all the answers, but that answers existed in the spaces between them, and in the bonds they chose to create. The emissary opened the bridge fully, and beyond it, Princess could see flickering glimpses of countless worlds, and some were beautiful, and some were terrifying, and all were waiting. She felt hand find hers and Amy fingers intertwine with theirs, and warm presence settled around them like protective wings. They stepped onto the bridge together and left behind their homes, but carried them in their hearts. The pact pulsed with their determination and spread through both Earth and reminding every connected soul that their champions had not abandoned them. Behind them, humans and elves stood together, watching them go and united in hope and pride. Ahead lay mysteries beyond imagination and challenges that would test everything they had become. But Princess knew with absolute certainty that they would face it all the same way they had faced everything else. They would face it together and bound by choice, rather than fate, and stronger for their differences, rather than despite them. The war for had ended months ago, but the war for connection and unity, and proving that different peoples could become one family, was just beginning. And Princess and an Amy and would fight it not with weapons, but with the most powerful force in any universe: the willingness to understand and to adapt and to care. As they crossed into the first of many worlds, Princess heard the emissary voice one more time. It said they took the final strike for each other and rose stronger, and now they should carry that strength to those who needed it most. The multiverse was waiting for its champions. And so they walked forward into destiny as three souls bound as one, and ready to teach infinite realities, that the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through connection.